although there's training programs focusing on developing emergency plans, you have to realize you're actually doing two tasks in this plan. You are, and I think they're intertwined, and we have to remember what they are. First of all, in your emergency planning and preparation, you're going to be developing a committee of people to help you put this plan together, both internal and external members. They're going to include administrators, they're going to include decision makers, but you also are going to have to develop an action team in handling an emergency. It's one thing to put in your emergency plan the people that are going to handle the emergency, but a lot of times when the emergency comes, you may have to adopt a different strategy there. So you maybe have to think of two distinct groups of individuals in developing your emergency plan. Both of these kind of groups require that you establish early a chain of command in developing these things. Now, the Getty plan is a very long guide. It's a great guide. It identifies in creating an emergency plan that you have a director, that is an administrator, who has the authority to ensure and tell staff that they are responsible for participating in this plan, that it is a priority of your organization, that it's something that everyone should get behind, that you have an emergency preparedness committee, the EPC, which is the committee that is really putting the plan together. You have an emergency preparedness manager, an EPM, who is really the chair of the committee and pushing to make sure that the plan gets developed, and that from the plan develops somebody called the Emergency Response Coordinator, ERC. Sometimes that person is chosen after you develop the plan, depending on the emergency, the nature, where it's situated in your organization, and so forth. Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time going through all of these people and all these details, but because every organization is different. The organization may only have just a few people in it. You may not have enough people to put in all these people that the Getty plan mentioned. I mean, that's great if you have a large, fantastic museum, but most organizations only have a handful of people, and so don't get hung up on trying to determine who is what. It is important that in the emergency plan that you kind of have a chain of command to handle the emergency. You've got to involve all areas of your agency, including your custodial staff, your paraprofessionals, your volunteers. You don't know who's going to be available and on hand to help you. You don't know what time of day an emergency will occur, and you've got to make sure all these people understand that they are part of the thing, that they're important, that they are part of an emergency plan. They are part of the organization to help you solve any problem, that it is part of their job and responsibility. I've seen a lot of job descriptions that people use, and many times they do not say, I also have a responsibility to handle and work with an emergency, and they need to do that. I really simplify it down a little bit. I really say that there are really only three groups of people you need to be concerned about, and that is, I call them the check writers, the problem solvers, and the problem handlers. And I think if you think in the nature of those three things and don't get hung up on all the things in the Getty plan, I think it will help you a little bit. The check writers, of course, are those individuals who have the monetary resources person to respond in an emergency. When an emergency comes along and you suddenly need money for supplies, a generator, or whatever, you really got to know how to do that, where that's coming from. And you're going to need to know this ahead of time. In an organization, you may have somebody who has the authority to commit to contracts. It might be the treasurer of the board of directors. It might be the director of your institution. It might be a fiscal assistant or somebody like that. You've got to know who that is. You also need to know about the insurance that you have. Who is your insurance agent? Who's the coverage, and so forth. Part of the plan and the emergency plan is to talk to your insurance agent. Find out also what is required by a policy. For example, some policies require that you simply stop the problem from getting bigger, and that you document everything so that they can reimburse all the costs. So you might have to make one of your staff members a documentation person, for example. But this is part of your plan, developing who is going to be the fiscal person. And don't make it a very simple thing because somebody in your group says, oh, well, I'll always be around. Those of us from Pensacola have been through quite a number of hurricanes. People leave town, they go and take care of their family, they're on vacation just at the time the emergency comes along, and all of a sudden that person is not there. You've got to make sure you identify in your plan who these people are, and also their backup people for that matter. The second category I call the problem solver. This is the person who's going to be what the Getty calls the emergency response coordinator. It's going to be the person on site that's going to say, here's the problem, and direct everything. And they're going to be the person who's going to decide how am I going to solve this problem, what kind of direction I'm going to give to the staff. It may be the person also communicating upward to the Board of Trustees, to the press, to whomever, as well as directing downward to the staff, telling them what to do. In a small organization, you could actually have two of the problem solvers. And one might be the one handling the resources and the communication, making sure the check gets written, get the supply in one hand. The other person might be one who's coordinating the staff and activities. It's going to depend on your organization. There's just no exact rules in this kind of situation. The emergency response requires a large section of people. The third area that I talk about are called the problem handlers. And of course, these are the people who are going to be doing the cleanup, the salvage, the volunteer. They're going to people who may need on-site supervision and training. One of the difficulties with volunteers in a situation is you may have dozens or hundreds of volunteers descend on you. Their hearts are in the right place. They have no idea what they're doing. Do you have the staff and resources to spend time training them? Sometimes there have been occasions in emergencies where volunteers have done more damage than good because they didn't know what they were doing. Sometimes wet books, for example, can be salvaged for a lot of time. But sometimes a volunteer will see something that's wet and say, oh, it's a wet piece of paper, throw it away. You're going to have to monitor these people. You're going to have to check on them, and they may need on-site. Well, your emergency plan gotta see how to use these things. For your committee, for your putting together your emergency response plan, you should consider utilizing external people and agency. And I talk about fire, water, civil defense, county emergency command, or whatever. You need to identify when you do your plan who these people are. If I were doing that plan right now, I'd be picking up the phone, I'd be calling people and say, who's the point person, who handles this? If you don't know, start working up the chain of command, call the local fire department and say, who handles this, who's in charge of a situation in my district, and so forth, and get some names and so forth. You could ask these people to serve on your preparedness committee in drafting the plan, which would be a great idea. Or if you don't want to involve people externally, or they seem reluctant to be a part of the committee, ask them if they'll review the plan when you're done. It would be helpful to be able to pass it along to some of these people and say, okay, does this cover everything, or do we have this solved? And they may be able to solve some problems for you. I mentioned the County Emergency Command simply because for Gambia County, where I'm in, we have a centralized emergency command center that is activated by the county at times of emergency. It's one building affair, a one-stop shop, if you will, where all the various commands can come together to facilitate communications and so forth. And you may need their help in a situation. On your people contacts, as part of your plan, you also need to have a master list of all of your staff, their names, their home addresses, their telephone. You need the staff home addresses. Don't let anyone say, oh, I only have a post office box, I don't give that out. You have a problem. Even somebody might have to drive to that person's home to get them. The phones may not work, the power may not work. Their cell phone, on the emergency contact list, you need their cell phone. You also need the name and address, phone number of a close relative. You can't catch them, maybe you can find them through their mother or their aunt or their sister or whatever. I know this sounds like investigative research or CSI, but nevertheless, in times of emergency, you may need to get in contact with staff. You need to have this list printed, and you need to update it regularly. I suggest that if you have a mechanism in your operation, at the university where I'm at, we have a process of hiring people, and there's a checklist that they run down as part of that process. You get this key, you get your ID card, that kind of thing. If you have such a thing, it should be on your list right there. Update your master list, emergency contact. It should be part of that. It should be automatic as you're doing that. These things need to be copies at home. They need to be copies at the office. They need to be printed. Do not count on the availability of a computer and the internet. And I speak of that firsthand, having gone through several hurricanes with no power for a while. There's just no way to get back and find the list and say, oh, I'm just going to look them up on the internet. Oh, wait a minute, it doesn't work. And so you need to have this widely available. You should be printed, should be updated, should be checked monthly to make sure there are no changes in that. Next part of the physical people factor are the physical issue. When you are trying to deal, I'll mention something else on the contact list from the external agency. Usually in a time of a crisis, most people call 911. In times of a crisis that is totally overwhelmed, there are actually a lot of other secret phone numbers that police and fire departments and other places use, and some of these external folks can be helpful to you in identifying those so that you don't end up in one of the thousands of people calling 911. The problem solvers, I mentioned that they are the people who are doing the cleanup. I will mention that there's a tendency to panic among the volunteers. I will come back to that at the end of this talk. You're going to have to decide whether to use those people. Also, as part of the emergency preparedness, you need to involve all staff. They all need to be trained. But in staff preparedness, you also need to identify physical issues that may be a part of your staff. You may have activities on your list in times of a disaster that are uncomfortable for some staff. You need to identify these earlier. Lynn mentioned earlier that molds have an allergy to a certain type of mold, for example. You may have staff that can't lift things. You may have staff that are uncomfortable about helping out. They may have phobias. There may be phobias of being in a cramped space. And believe me, basements and dorm and attics and an emergency can be real cramped spaces. And so you need to identify those kinds of things. They may be people who are just allergic to ash, soot, dust, debris, other areas of that. And that may be true for volunteers. In my department, from years ago, we got a very large collection. It was a very old collection. All the items were held together with rusty pins. We had the staff all take tetanus shots in processing that kind of thing. You may be in another type of situation. Finally, as part of the people factor, you have to expect some psychological and physical effects. And I got these from from one of the great emergency manuals. I'll cite it here in the next slide. But you have to expect to be shaken, horrified, blanked, and even angry. One of the things is a feeling of urgency and need to react quickly, and that it is important that the emergency coordinator, the problem solver, as I call it, be the person to say, step back, take a calm breath. What do we need to do first? What is our priority? You may expect an adrenaline high, which is true, but you also, that's always followed by an adrenaline low, which is to be avoided, and so it's one of those things. There may be a tendency to overreact, and that happens a lot. You can expect chaos and disorganization at first, and then occasionally throughout the response effort. Things are not going to get solved in a day after a disaster, and it's important that people recognize that. In Pensacola, we had a terrible disaster. We had thousands of trees down and limbs. People were out cleaning up the yard and piling them in the street like they expected the garbage truck to show up the next day and haul them away. And that didn't happen, and you just have to decide what you can do. You can expect to feel that you can't think clearly. You can expect to think that you probably ruined the whole response effort, or you've ruined valuable material. You can expect to be tired, dirty, hungry, and discouraged. And I have gone through that. I've gone through several weeks without power after a hurricane when it's 90 degrees every day, 95 degrees. You can get tired, dirty, hungry, and discouraged. I will say that in my case, I came from the Midwest. I've gone through major snowstorms and ice storms. I have family that live in the country that could be snowbound for a week at a time, would not be able to get across the road. So my first hurricane in Pensacola, I pretty much knew what to expect. I mean, I had food that I didn't have to refrigerate. I had water. I went to the store and got little wipes so I didn't have to do wash and stuff like that. These are all kinds of things that you're going to have to think of when you're dealing with the psychological and the physical effects of a disaster. Before I get to the question, I will mention, again, that I really think there's two aspects to the people factor in the emergency plan. They have to be, first is developing the emergency plan and involving your staff and beginning a program of training and knowledge. And then, of course, there is how you respond to the plan in a crisis or a development. And my experience has been many times in crises that one of the difficulties have been that people may not be available. You will have staff that are on vacation. You will have staff that are out sick. You will have staff that left town to take care of their mother, whatever. And so you think, aha, Bert is always going to be on site and take care of my disaster. And by golly, it happened that 1 week of the year that he took off to go up Indy 500 or something. So you have to plan those kind of things. And I think we're ready for questions and answers.
This is Miriam in Sarasota, and I know that Dean has suggested that some of us, if we can, we type in some of the questions because they sometimes are having a little bit of a hard time hearing. But let me ask around and see who might have questions around the different cities.
Security issue is releasing the contact list to staff, or rather who should release the contact list to. I think that can be a problem in this day of privacy where everybody wants privacy, but I think as a part of a cultural institution like a library, a museum, or archive, I think you're going to have to, in your hiring process, indicate to people that this is crucial information that is needed by your employer, that responding to emergency is an important part of that. I don't see any way around that. I don't believe that you can just tell somebody, oh, you don't have to give me your address or your phone number or whatever, because you're going to need that information should any kind of situation arise in your museum. An object is missing. We read about embezzlement of funds, for example. We've had cases in museums where a person shows up and says, I gave you this object last week, I gave it to a staff member, I never heard from anything, that type of situation. And so I think your emergency in being able to get to the staff far override this whole issue of my information is private. And if they don't want to give you that information, they probably should not be on your staff. Another question I see here from Miami, is it a good idea to include masks in the supply list for use in emergency situations? Yes, there are different kinds of masks. There are simple pollen masks, there are dust masks. I think they're a must. I use them when I'm cleaning out attics or barns or whatever. I do have a gas mask in my department. The purchasing department people went haywire when they got the request for the gas mask for someone in the library because they got kind of worried about that. But I do some deacidification work, and we had to use that for some of the fumes. I think it is, but there are different kinds of masks, and they may not be effective for all people. You may think a gas mask, a regular face mask that's used for an allergy situation may not be strong enough for somebody. But you're going to need to identify those kind of staff. Another question we have is, should people take care of family first or the collection first? Well, we just had a little discussion about that when we were talking about priorities. Lynn Robertson said that our first priority was to save people, get people out. And I have sat in committee meetings where those of us who are dedicated archivists, librarians, museum curators, we are dedicated to protecting our collection. Okay, we would be running back into the building to save that special item. Clearly, the purpose of emergency planning is to save people. It is to save your staff. It is to save your visitors. It is to save your client. But we also would not be doing this if we weren't convinced that we have a personal interest in saving our collection. That's why we're in this profession. We're in this profession to save culture and history, preserve it, make it available to people. So I think it's going to be one of those hard questions. And there are certainly people who have lost their lives because they've gone back into burning buildings to save some rare object or whatever. It's going to depend on every type of crisis.